Well, you've got a new rifle, you've changed calibers, different powder, different bullets, and you've worked up your cartridge for what you think is going to be the most accurate you can get to. So you've done your load development, you've done your seating depth, you're putting single holes or close to single holes at 100 yards, and you think you're ready to go out to that match and start ringing steel at 800 yards. And not quite yet. There's one more thing you need to do. Hi everyone, it's the 4-Gun Guy. And today I want to talk about truing our dope. I've had a lot of comments on different videos over the past month or so about this, so I wanted to do a video on it. So what I want to cover today is let's talk about the definition of truing our dope. What do we mean by that? And the aspects that it covers. Let's talk about those preliminary steps that we need to take before we even think of truing our dope. Then I want to talk about the actual process that I use to true my dope, from what I have my ballistics calculator set up with, to when I get out to the range, how I actually true my dope, and then what some other people do as well, which is similar but just a little bit different. Then I want to talk about some other considerations from a ballistics app standpoint, and that is I use what's called a custom drag model or a custom curve, but if you don't, what do you need to consider if you don't? And then finally, I want to talk about some variances to truing our dope for our 22 competitions or our 22 rifles, because there's a little difference there. And then one other thing that we'll talk about, and that might be some temperature stability, and then some final thoughts. So if you're ready to go, let's get to it. Truing our dope means this: whatever this tells me, whatever I dial in this scope should be the same thing, and I should impact the target at distance. That's it. It's that simple, right? I'm trying to make this thing and this thing sync up. That's it. So what does all that mean from a kind of a more technical perspective? Well, when we're using centerfire, we're going to talk about our centerfire rounds. I'm going to talk about a 6mm BRA, although the rifle behind me is a 6.5 Creedmoor, but let's talk about a 6mm BRA. Here's the rifle. I fire a round, and let's say we're going to go 900 yards, right? Somewhere out in here, when this bullet leaves the barrel, it is going to be traveling at a supersonic velocity, okay? Somewhere out here, I think the calculations I've done, somewhere around 950 yards, it's going to start dropping in velocity from supersonic towards subsonic. So out to here, we're talking about something around Mach 1.2, and then somewhere, let's say, I don't know, 1100 yards maybe? Let's say that that's where it reaches Mach 0.8, which is subsonic. And these are the three boundaries we're talking about. We're talking about the supersonic, the transonic, and the subsonic. What we're trying to do here is match the Kestrel or whatever ballistic device we have at these different boundaries, so as our bullet goes through these boundaries, it still remains on the target at that distance. Let's talk about how we set all this up and the process that I use to true my dope. Before we get to the process, sorry I skipped a step, let's talk about the preliminary things that you need to have done before you true your dope. Now, I talked about those in my intro, so I'm not going to cover too much of those, right? We need to have, number one, the scope and the rifle zeroed. So at 100 yards, we are putting a single hole in the center dot of a target. This is not groups. This is centering, zeroing our scope. So you should have done your load development. You've got your seating depth that you like. You're putting that single hole or close to it at 100 yards on paper. And now we want to make sure that it's not only on paper, it is on the center dot of that target. That's one of the most critical things to get done before you go to truing your dope. Because if you're off at 100 yards, you're just magnifying that difference out at distance. So really, that's what we need to do before we get to truing our dope. Now we're ready to true. Now, here's what I do. I have my Kestrel, and I have a Kestrel 5700 Elite, and I have loaded what's called a custom drag model or a custom curve into my Kestrel. That's what I use. There's a benefit to that in that there's only one thing that I generally need to adjust in my Kestrel, and that is my muzzle velocity. That's really what I need to adjust to make these two things match up. So here's the process. I get to the range, and I'm going to use my little cheat sheet here. I get to the range, and I have my initial velocity because why? Well, we did our load development, and we did our seating depth tests, and we did all of that. That gave us our velocity of our bullet, right? Of the round that we're going to use. Now, I'm not going to get into what if you don't have a chronograph. Get a chronograph, okay? I might do a video on if you don't, but for this purpose, if you don't have one, borrow one from a friend. Everybody has a chronograph, right? So I don't care if it's a cheaper one, a more expensive one, whatever, get one. We have our initial velocity, and what I will do is set up a profile in my Kestrel or whatever app or device I'm using, and that profile will be for this new rifle or cartridge. In that profile, I'm going to start with a muzzle velocity. I go to the gun, I type muzzle velocity, let's say 2745. My BRA is actually running at 2754 velocity, average velocity. So you can see these two numbers don't match up, but I'm still hitting a 1,000-yard 1 MOA target. We'll talk about that in a little bit. I put the initial velocity in my Kestrel. Now the way I do it is I get on the bench as stable as I can be, and I start at 500 yards. 500 yards, and let's just pretend that this is the watermark, this shelf up here. This is the watermark. 500 yards, I fire some rounds down there, say 3, 1, 2, 3. I'm a little low. I'm not doing anything yet. Not going to do anything. I'm going to now go to 600 yards in my Kestrel. I'm going to dial that in my scope. And at 600 yards, I'm looking for a water line. At 600 yards, I'm here, here, and here. So I'm still low. So automatically I know we're low. That's okay. I go to 700 yards. 3 shots, 700 yards. One's up here, 2 are down here. I'm still low. This is when I'll start to tweak. So let's say that I am at 700 yards, I'm 7 inches low, which is what? About 1 MOA, which is what? About 3/10 of a mil. So I'll come up 3/10 of a mil. I'll send 3 shots, and now I'm right around in here. I'm feeling good. This is telling me at 700 yards that I should be at 5.1 mils of elevation. But I'm hitting the center line on the 700-yard target at 5.4 mils of elevation. We're all good, all good. Then I'll jump out to the 850 rack. Now there's an 850 rack at my range, and it's got a nice big 3 MOA target on there, which is at 3 MOA at 850 yards is about 30 inches, right? So I'll either have someone spotting for me or I'll have my scope all the way zoomed in. I send 3 initial rounds down there, and let's say that I'm right here, right? Right in here. I'll bring it up a 1/10, send 3 rounds, and now I'm right around here. Notice I'm saying around here. I am not going to waste 100 rounds of ammunition to try to get every shot on this center line. I'm not going to do it. If you want to do it, knock yourself out, but you're going to be pulling your hair out because there's so many other factors that are affecting that bullet flight in that 850 yards downrange. One other thing I did want to mention is please make sure that you've calibrated your device if you're using a device like this, and you've done your environmentals. So I've gone to environment, live, done environmentals, so everything is up to date on the Kestrel. Forgot to mention that. Well, now, right, we have come up a total of, so at 850 yards, my Kestrel is telling me that I should be at 7.12. On my scope, I'm at 7.6. I have to make these two match. Well, I can't do anything about this part of the equation because this is just hard facts. The fact is that with this cartridge in this rifle, running out that barrel at the velocity that it does, it's impacting that 850 yard target at 7.6 mils. So I have to do something with this. That's where we make the adjustment. Now I'm going to go back to the fact that I use that custom curve. So it's easy for me to come into my gun, go to muzzle velocity. There's a couple ways I can do this. I can either change the muzzle velocity in here, and it will change my elevation, right? My D.O.P.E, my drop factor, so to speak, in the gun. So I could come in here and let's think about this. If I have to come up 4/10, that means that I'm low on the target. What do I have to do to the velocity to cheat this thing into coming up 4/10? Do I have to raise my velocity or lower my velocity? I have to lower it. As I lower my velocity, it's going to change the elevation in this thing, the drop factor, by saying the velocity is getting lower, you need to raise your rifle effectively, aim higher on the target to impact the target. And so that's what's going to happen. I'm going to change my velocity in here until it reads, until my elevation reads 7.6. When this reads 7.6 and that reads 7.6, I should be calibrated. Now, once I'm calibrated, then I'm going to validate that. Wait a minute. You validated you trued at 850. Shouldn't you have trued further out? Let's talk about that in a minute. Now I'm going to go to 900. It's only 50 more yards. And I'm going to validate that whatever this says at 900 yards, which is 7.95, I'll probably go 7.9, and I'll see if I can impact the 900 yards. If I impact 900 yards center line, around the center line, then I'm good. Then I will go out because we have 1,000 yards at the range. I'll go out to 1,000 yards, which is 9.67 or 9.7 mils. I'll dial up 9.7 mils, impact the target. Now I'm good out to 1,000. I'm going to come back in probably to my 700, 3 rounds, validate, 600, 3 rounds, validate, 500, 3 rounds, validate, 4, and then I come down to about 320 because at 320 yards at our range, we have some smaller targets. I want to say they're probably 2 MOA, so 6 inches, 6.5 inches, something like that. I'll validate on those, and then I'm done. I'm done. I've trued my D.O.P.E. Don't play with it anymore. For that scenario, that temperature, where I am, everything is fine. If you go into the Kestrel manual, it will talk to you. There'll be a section in there saying calibrate muzzle velocity, cal MV. It's going to say you need to find the distance, remember the distance, that the bullet is going to travel to this transonic boundary where it drops off from Mach 1.2. So it's trying to find this. If I plug that into my 6mm BRA and I say cal MV, it tells me that at the velocity that I'm running, I should be calculating my muzzle velocity, truing my dope, at 945 yards. So at 850, I'm not that far off. Now, you'll see that the manual also says that you can calibrate within 10 to 15% below this distance if you have to. Well, 15% of 945 is what, about 145 roughly feet per second? So I can calibrate at 800 and I'd be okay. I naturally calibrate at 850, I'm good. Okay, so I wanted to kind of address that because I know there'll be some comments if you read this, the Kestrel manual. If you are shooting, remember what I just told you my muzzle velocity is. I run slow. I run 2754 muzzle velocity on a 6mm bullet. Most of these guys are running 2900, 2950. When you do this cal MV, it's going to tell you, yeah, you got to go out to 1200 yards or 1150 yards to calibrate your or to true your dope, right? But then if you take that 10 to 15% away from that, let's say it says 1150 yards, you take the 15% away from that, now you're back down to that 1000 yards. So you would probably want to true at 1000 yards. I'm just saying, if you don't have that distance at your range, true to what you can true to. At least you'll be true at that distance more or less in, right? So it's just going to depend on your situation and what you're doing. Now, the other thing I want to talk to is what's called calibrate your DSF, your drop scale factor. So let's talk about that for a second. If you are not going to use the custom curve model, right, or the custom drag model, which is custom curve, then you may want to also perform what's called calibrate DSF, the drop scale factor. So this is where you're using the BC of your bullet. Generally it's the G7 because these are boat tail bullets. You'll use the G7, and basically what this is telling you is it's helping you with these different boundaries. That's what it's helping you with. So if you read the Kestrel manual, it says right here, DSF calibration is used when shooting beyond the supersonic range of a bullet. Our supersonic range is 945 bullet, while using a G1 or G7 standard drag model. So if you came into this Kestrel and just entered the G7 of that bullet or the G1, you would or could use this calibrate DSF, the drop scale factor. But here's what it says, but is typically unnecessary if using a custom drag model. That's why I use the custom drag model. I don't have to mess with the DSF calculations at all. So the custom drag model is something that Brian Litz and Applied Ballistics have done for us, thousands of rounds of that bullet, and they've calculated this model that plugs right into the Kestrel, so it makes it to where all I need to do is adjust my velocity. Some people will say, oh, that thing never works for me. I don't use the custom drag model. I do the DSF calibration at distance. And great. Guys, if you've seen any of my videos, whatever works for you, that's what this is about, right? Just follow the process that works for you. I'm just giving you those two options here and what they mean. I also run 22 matches. So I have a profile in my Kestrel, 22 SK match, which is the ammo that I use now. I used to use Center X, now I've gone to SK match. It just works better in the rifle I have. And so I have a profile for SK match. Now the 22s can be different. I will tell you that I use a custom drag model for my 22 as well. It has served me well, out to 350 yards, 400 yards, 350 especially. I'm hitting that target in a match. So the custom curve model has served me well. I shoot with other guys who will not touch a custom curve or custom drag model in 22s. They use the DSF model, Cal DSF. And that is because if you look at a 22, you're at, if any, supersonic, you are generally firing in the subsonic range with a 22, or right out of the barrel within 50 yards, it's dropping into that subsonic range. And so that's why a lot of people go to that DSF, that Cal DSF model, because they'll have different distances that the Kestrel, and it'll do it for you. You just have to set it up. They have different distances that this thing is calculating. So if I tell it I have a target at 275, it uses a different factor in arriving at the solution. If I tell it my target's at 175, it could be using a different factor, drop scale factor, to calculate that solution. That's all that means. But I have had very good luck with just using the custom drag model. And again, with the 22, all I'm doing is adjusting my velocity, and it's worked well for me. One last thing I wanted to talk about are temperature considerations. I had a question on that as well. Does temperature affect these things? Sure it does. Sure, a lot of things affect these things, right? I have a profile that I use in here for this rifle, for my other centerfire rifle, that's 6BRA. And it all depends on, in my opinion, a couple factors. Number one, what different weather conditions are we shooting in, right, throughout the year? So here in Texas, I'm near Houston. I can be shooting in 108-degree weather. In fact, it was 110 one of our matches this year. This winter, I can be shooting in 23-degree weather, which I shot in a couple years ago. And last year, I think I shot in a couple 28 and 34-degree weather matches. If you're not shooting a temp stable powder like H4895, this is what I use for my 6mm BRA. I use H4350 for my 6.5 Creedmoor here. Those are both very good temp stable powders. In other words, they can withstand a big variability in temperature. And I did a video on that here probably about a month and a half ago, so you might want to look that one up, where I actually showed what the difference in velocity can do out at distance, at like 900 yards. If my velocity is 20 feet per second difference, what does that mean at 900 yards? Is it that big of a difference? Look that one up. It'll give you some good information. But that can factor into it your rifle, the mechanics of the rifle, the temperature of your barrel, right? In the summertime, that's why we use barrel coolers in these things when we're done shooting a stage, because if that barrel gets really, really too hot, yes, that can affect your muzzle velocity, which then will affect your truing, right? So I'm just saying, these are some things to look at. Do you need two profiles, a summer and a winter profile? You could if you live in a very diverse environment that if you are shooting in 25-degree weather one week and the next week you're shooting in 87-degree weather, which I don't think we have any of that around here. But generally speaking, to be really honest with you, and this is where the chronograph comes back into play, I'll go to a match, I'll set up my chronograph, I'll chrono my first 5 shots, because I usually foul anyway, right? I shoot fouling shots, and then I may shoot some zeros just to make sure I'm still on zero on paper. And if I look and see that my velocity is that far off, say 20 feet per second off, then I may make an adjustment in my Kestrel. Generally speaking, I won't make that adjustment until after the first stage. So the first stage of a match, if I'm sitting there going, I was hitting low on pretty much everything, or it's a distance stage, and I hit low. And there's a whole nother story of you need to see where you're missing the target if you are. And if you're missing low, you need to adjust during the stage, but that needs to stay with you after the stage. Make sure it was not you. Make sure it was your rifle. There have been times where after the first stage of a match, I've adjusted. I have looked at the dope I ended up with on this scope. I actually had to dial 2 more tenths. When I came off the stage, I immediately looked at the scope. I looked at my Kestrel. I came in, adjusted my velocity, so this matched that, and I was great for the rest of the day. So I guess the whole thing here is, you may have to make some on-the-fly adjustments, and that's okay. Well, let's get to some final thoughts. Well, final thoughts, let's recap. I use a custom drag model or custom curve in my Kestrel, which really helps me chew my dope easier. All I need to know is the bullet. I download the custom drag model for that bullet, and I'm good to go. Other people use the G factor, right? The BC bullet coefficient. They'll use the G7, and they'll adjust their drop scale factor in this out to the different boundaries. Remember, we have the supersonic, the transonic, and the subsonic boundaries, and they'll do it that way. It's going to depend on how you want to do it, how you want to set up your rifle or rifles. So then we make sure our scope is zeroed, our rifle and scope are hitting a 100-yard target center dot. Then we will go to truing, where our Kestrel or whatever device we're using is the environments are set, where you are, latitude, longitude, you've calibrated the device, and then we'll start walking out. A really top shooter in the region here told my buddy Rich that he makes sure his zero is spot on at 100 yards. He validates at 500. He goes immediately out to 1,000, trues his dope, and he's done. Then he knows he's done. So it just depends on what you want to do. After we've trued our dope, I like to validate walking back in. So I walk out my dope for validation for truing. I walk it back in to validate, and then I'm all set. So there you have it. I hope this helped, and I really appreciate the subscriptions, the likes, the comments are great. Let's keep it friendly. We're a great group of people here, and I really appreciate that. And until next time, guys, true your dope and shoot straight.